Hello, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. Today we're going to be talking about my top 10 palettes for Valentine's Day. So I love Valentine's Day. I just love the whole premise of the day. I just think it's very cute, and I am so excited that we are finally in February. So I thought I would share my top 10 picks for those more pinky leaning Valentine's Day romantic eyeshadow looks. So let's get into it. I do have a mix of both older palettes and newer palettes. I just like to have a little bit of everything in here. So starting with probably the newest, this is the YSL Couture Mini Clutch in 125. And I just like this one. I think it's really pretty. This is their Valentine's Day launch for this year, and I do think the color story is beautiful. Now, it's definitely not as pink leaning. It's got more of a purple mauve leaning effect to it, minus this shade here, which is a little bit more peachy. But the reason I feel like it's more Valentine's Day is because when I think Valentine's Day, I definitely think pink and red, but I also think a lot of those mauve-y tones can also be very beautiful. So I think this palette is really pretty, and when you add in that very iridescent shimmer in the top corner, I feel like you always get a very romantic kind of look. So for that reason, I think this is a really good one. I do absolutely love the YSL formula so much. I just think they're fantastic. The mattes are so incredibly creamy. And the shimmer in here, even though it is more of an iridescent topper, it is really beautiful. And this palette in particular even has little heart embossments in the shades. So it definitely makes me feel very Valentine's Day. The other new palette I want to talk about is from Nars, and this is their Sweet Kiss Quad, and this is also part of their Amore collection for Valentine's Day. So this is really pretty. This is definitely a color story that is great for any time of year, but you do have this pink, you have a red here, and then you have this more pinky shimmer. So I think that goes without saying that it's definitely, in my eyes, a very Valentine's Day-esque little quad. But I do think this is one that's also going to be appropriate year-round. I also just love the Nars formula. I find their mattes to be so incredibly blendable and silky. And the shimmer is one of those that is baked, and it's more of a thin formula. So it's not one of those that is going to be texture enhancing on the lids, if that's maybe a reason that you tend to stay away from shimmers. The Nars formula, in particular this baked formula that they do with their shimmers sometimes, is perfect for that because it's never going to enhance texture. It's just going to give you that beautiful wet effect on the lids. So I do think this is very beautiful, and the pinks, the reds definitely always stand out to me as Valentine's Day color stories. The packaging on this one is of course very perfect for this time of year, and I just think it's a really nice quad, and I think it's really well done. The next palette is also a newer palette, but it came out back in July, and I think it was intended to be a fall launch, but this is from Too Faced, and this is their Appley in Love palette. So this one I really like, and I know looking at it you're gonna see a lot of very fall tones in here, and I absolutely agree. But what kind of steers me towards some really great Valentine's Day looks in here is the mix of pinks and reds and berries that we have in here. Because even though we do have some of these greens, even some of these more mustard yellows, some of these warmer tones, we do get some really beautiful reds and pinks, and the thing is that they're actually so easy to work together. So I have always avoided more of these reddish tones. I've never liked reds on my eyes, but then this palette, I was actually able to create a look that I really liked that incorporated a red. And this palette really kind of pushed me into that a little bit toward the end of last year. I found I was definitely not as afraid to incorporate reds into my eyeshadow looks. There is a trick to it to not make yourself look ill when you're using a red. You definitely want to have something on your lower lash line, and usually a liner is ideal to sort of break up that red, but a red can be so beautiful, and this is the palette that taught me that and sort of pushed me out of that comfort zone. If I recall correctly, I think I used this shade in the crease, and then I went in with this berry right here, and then this shimmer all over the lid, and it was such a pretty look, and I felt like even back then it felt very Valentine's Day-esque, so I thought that was perfect. So while this palette still has a lot of fall elements to it, definitely makes me think of fall, definitely a palette I'm going to pull out at that time, I do think it's very appropriate for right now as well. Okay, we do have some Natasha Denona options here. I don't think this would be a true Valentine's Day video without one of those. But I do have the Mini Love palette from Natasha. So this palette is a few years old at this point, and this palette really made use of these more mauve-y tones. We have this sort of eggplant purple in the middle. We have that beautiful champagne shimmer and then some brighter pinks. This palette also, I feel like, is just so beautiful and easy to work with. This mauve tone is so beautiful all over the lids, and I think you can get a really beautiful look. And if you're not someone who loves pinks and reds, I do think a mauve eyeshadow is just such a good way to incorporate a more romantic look if you're not wanting to go too smoky or too deep, but you still want the sort of more romantic, feminine type look. I think mauve can be a great way to do that. And if you have blue eyes, that can also be really, really beautiful. So I do really like this as well. I think this is a stunning color story, especially for Valentine's Day without being too pink. We do have pink in here, but it's not too pink, so I do like that. I also pulled out her Mini Rose palette that she came out with last year, and this palette is interesting because some of the shades in here are definitely repeat shades. So we have the shade Opart, Psychedelic, and Andy, which are already in the retro palette. And then this shade right here in the middle, Flamingo, I believe this was also a repeat shade, as was Golden Rose. Now Golden Rose, I think, very much reminds me of Nars Orgasm. So if you have any Nars palettes that have the Orgasm shade in it, you're going to be able to have this shade. Most of us have this one already, but I do think this color story is so beautiful. This is actually the palette I'm wearing today. I really love this one. This can be such a soft palette. You can deepen it up a little bit if you want to. I love that Flamingo shade right in the middle because it is the perfect shade for just blending the edges and sort of diffusing everything. And Psychedelic is just so sparkly and gorgeous. I really did enjoy the Mini Rose. I don't love that it was all repeat shades, but I do think it's such a beautiful little palette, especially for this time of year. And speaking of the retro palette, I have her right here because I always recommend the retro for Valentine's Day. Again, going into those romantic mauve tones, we do have some of these more reddish berry tones in here as well. We do have some of these more peachy tones if that's how you prefer to go. But this palette is just absolutely perfect for Valentine's Day. I love mauves so much. And this is a palette that has been so well loved and used by me. The shade Andy is actually the one I have all over my lid today from the Mini Rose. But in the Mini Rose, it's a powder formula. In here, it is a cream to powder, but it's my most used shade in this palette as well. Maybe aside from Vivian, I also have dipped into the shimmers in here a lot too because they're just so sparkly and beautiful and pink and feminine. I love that this palette can go very deep. You can get a lot of depth with it, but you can also just go very, very soft. You can really do whatever you want. You can also go very ethereal with those two shimmer shades, especially Psychedelic, which is right here. So I think this is definitely one of my favorites this time of year. I love this palette for all year round. I really do. And this is definitely one of my more reached for palettes. So I really do think this one's fantastic. The most obvious Natasha Denona palette to pull out is the Love palette. So this one, I believe, is definitely the most Valentine's Day of all of the palettes I have. This was actually a Valentine's launch a few years ago. I think this may have been 2019 or 2020. I purchased this one well after that, but this has just the most beautiful mix of pinks and reds, but also purples. And then we have a gorgeous silver in here. We have some of these browns that have sort of a more pink element to them. And then of course the shade names are also very love inspired. So it's just definitely perfect for this time of year. And I do think you can create some really, really gorgeous pinky looks. In terms of quality, I like the quality of this one, but I don't think it's Natasha's best ever quality. I do think she's come out with a lot of really fantastic formulas since this time, but I do still think this is fantastic. In my 2024 year-end eyeshadow palette ranking, I actually was wearing a shade out of this palette. I was wearing this shade right here as the red in my outer corner, and I absolutely loved how that look turned out, and I thought it was kind of fun that I was reaching into this palette at Christmas time, but I do think this is a fantastic Valentine's Day palette, and this is kind of the only time of year that I'm really tempted to reach for this one. Like I said, it's definitely very intense on these pinks and purples, and it's not her best formula that she has, so I don't reach for it all the time, but Valentine's Day, I can't resist. The next palette is actually somewhat similar to the retro palette, and this is the Sigma New Mod palette. I really like this one, and I feel like Sigma is a brand that their eyeshadow palettes get better and better. The newer the palette, the better the formula, which I think is really interesting. I have the Enchanted palette and I like it, but I don't love the formula. I have this one and I really, really like it. And then I got the Cool Neutrals last year and I love it. So they definitely are improving, but I will say the formulas in here are also fantastic. I love that in here we get these pinks and we get these more berry leaning shades, some mauves in here, but then we also have some very basic neutral browns and golds. I just think this is such a beautiful palette. I use this one quite a bit, and I particularly work with this little quad right here on the end. Big surprise, but I do love dipping into some of these shades down here as well. This is very similar to the retro palette, just in some of these mauve tones, some of these pinks in here, but this one I do think gives you a little bit more range just because you also get some of these golds and these more neutral browns. So I do think this one is really, really nice if you don't want to go fully mauve, but you like the vibe of the retro palette. I think the new mod is beautiful. I love the velvet packaging on this one. I think this is one of my favorite mauve tone palettes. The next palette is from Huda Beauty, and this is her Rose Quartz palette, and even the shades in here that look brown actually have a bit more of a purple undertone to them. So this is a very pinky purple dream of a palette. It's so beautiful. I love this for all of her pink tones. The only shade I don't really like in here or use is this shade right here, which is kind of the Petri dish shade. This was my absolute favorite Huda palette, I would say, until Pretty Grunge came out. Pretty Grunge and Icy Nude are kind of duking it out for the top slot, but I really, really do love this one. I think it's such a beautiful palette. I love that you can get depth with this, but you can also just create the most ethereal looks with this palette. We have these pinks, we have these purples, we have these browns that really just lean purple. We have these deeper purples, but then we have these super reflective, ethereal looking shades. I always say Huda is the queen of texture, which is part of why I'm sad that she doesn't want to do her larger palettes anymore. I think she will be sticking to these more 9 pans, but if she's doing that, I at least hope that she is using this formula, because this is the superior formula for Huda, and I feel like she's always been the queen of texture. She's not afraid to shy away from new textures, and she does a really great job. These shades in here are just so reflective and shiny, and toward the end of 2024 for the holidays, the Sugar Plum Fairy look was kind of going around, and this palette was essentially perfect for that. I don't know if I saw anybody use this palette to create that look, but this palette would have been perfect. I love everything about this one, but because it is so pinky, mauve-y leaning, I do think it's of course perfect for Valentine's Day. And the largest in this roundup is from Colourpop, and this is the Smokin' Roses palette. This is fantastic, and I think very underrated. So there is a ton of shades in here, so I can definitely see how that would be overwhelming. We have a lot of pinks, we have some of these more red leaning shades, we have a couple of berries, but we also have some neutral browns, so you can go so many different routes with this. You can create so many different pinky looks, and while I think some of these shades are a little bit redundant, there's a little bit of overlap, I still think it's such a beautiful palette, and if you love pink, I think this is such a good one, and this is one of their better formulas. I know sometimes with Colourpop, I feel like their palettes, some of them are great quality, some of them are a little not so much. This one I think is really great quality. These shimmers are so incredibly buttery and shiny. The mattes are so blendable and easy to work with. You can build them up very, very easily. And this was a palette I had looked at many, many times. and just always talked myself out of, but I happened to be at an Ulta one day. I swatched it because it was on display and I couldn't not bring it home because it was just such a beautiful color story and the feel of the shades was just amazing. So I think this is a great one if you're looking for a much more affordable option. Colourpop Smoke and Roses is definitely one of my favorite Colourpop palettes of all time. But that is it. Those are all of the palettes that I am excited to play with going into Valentine's Day and throughout the month of February. I love my pinky tones in general. I absolutely love mauves, but let me know down below some of your favorite palettes for this time of year. What are your favorite pinky leaning palettes? Let me know all of your thoughts down below. I just love hearing from you guys so much. If you're new here, I hope you'll consider subscribing before you go. I do upload new videos every single week. Thank you again so very much for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!